This video is brought to you by Patreon. Patreon! Pop pop fizz fizz. Oh, what a relief it is. 1982. The Falkland War begins and ends, Israel invades Lebanon, and 750,000 people gather in Central Park to protest nuclear weapons. The Midwestern United States is surprised by a cold snap, bringing temperatures to record lows. 7 people in Chicago are murdered from Tylenol laced with cyanide, and Larry Walters ties 55 weather balloons to a lawn chair and takes flight. We see the releases of the Commodore 64, Thriller, and E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which Atari adapted into a video game. I'm sure nothing bad will come of that. Time magazine names The Computer as their Man of the Year, and we see the births of Seth Rogen, Anne Hathaway, and Danny Tamborelli. In the world of television, it wasn't the most exciting year, but there were a few things of note. The big new addition to cable was the Weather Channel. Not the sexiest channel around, but a mainstay in cable packages everywhere. ESPN broadcast its first live college football game, CNN 2 premiered, later renamed CNN Headline News, and TBS created the very first video game-themed game show with Starcade. As for Nickelodeon, 1982 would mark the peak of the Cy Schneider years, the year that his vision of edutainment, of PBS you paid for, reached its zenith. This was the year Cy Schneider started personally making shows for Nickelodeon. Not just commissioning shows, but developing, producing, and working on his own actual original content. 5 shows premiered this year, 2 original programs and 3 imports, but more interesting is that almost nothing from the previous year was cut. The only show cancelled in 1982 was Vegetable Soup, which sucks because I think it was their best show at this time. Come on guys, what will they think of next is right there. But Nickelodeon would not be left without a show about the children of other cultures. Vegetable Soup would find a replacement in Spread Your Wings.
Our Oberamura paper is special because when finished, it looks like a painting. Only no paints are used. It's all just paper. We make paper from the bark of the koso tree, which grows around our village. The bark is steamed, stripped from the branches, and cleaned before we get it. Then we boil it to make it soft.
A Canadian production, Spread Your Wings profiled children from around the world with a focus on the craftwork of their cultures. In Japan, 13-year-old Yoshiko learns how to make paper from hand from an old master, a process rapidly becoming lost from industrialization. In Ethiopia, 12-year-old Johannes wants to become a doctor, but his parents insist on him learning a trade first, so he becomes an apprentice of a silversmith and learns how to cast Coptic crosses. In Shanghai, China, 16-year-old Xiaoping rehearses with a troupe of acrobats in preparation for a major television performance. In West Germany, 16-year-old Stefan takes classes to make violins, a family tradition going back 5 generations. We see kids making stained glass windows in France, carpets in India, saddles in Morocco, parasols in Thailand. In total, 26 films were produced, covering 22 countries. The United States, Canada, China, and India got 2 films each. How these films played out was that half of the time was spent with the actual craft work, showing us in beautiful detail the process of making these items or preparing for these performances. We watch these young people learn their crafts, and we learn along with them. Since most of these subjects don't speak English, a narrator speaks as their voice, framing the student as a teacher.
The top of the violin is made of spruce because it's a soft wood and resonates well. Finally, 2 holes are cut in the top. These are called F-holes. They are most important because the music made by the vibration of the strings and the body of the violin comes out through these openings.
The other half of the time on these documentaries is spent on the day-to-day lives of these children. We visit their families, we see them cooking meals and sitting around the table in conversation. We watch these young people in recreation, in chores, in transit. We get a sense of the place they live in, the communities they're part of. Common images include people hanging out on busy streets, social gatherings and celebrations, games and dance and song. American or Canadian kids watching this would recognize the same kind of emotions they go through in their lives. It creates a connection. The narration is a necessity to discuss the details of the craftwork and explain the subject matter's relations with other people on the screen, but I was surprised at how sparse and spread out their narration was. There are long stretches of time, multiple minutes without narration, where people talk in their native languages without any translation, or just don't talk at all. And you have to suss out meaning from their expressions, gestures, and the larger context of the story. This is a great deal of faith given to the audience, one that most production companies would shy away from, especially when the presumed target audience is children. But it's commendable for not erasing the voices of these real people living their real lives, and kind of harkens back to the methods of silent films, where you had to communicate as much information visually as you can, and only falling on the words, title cards with silent movies, and the narrator with Spread Your Wings when absolutely necessary. Part of the reason why these films keep your attention is through some impressive camera work. These are not point-and-shoot documentaries. There's a lot of careful consideration for inventive placement. This really stands out in the acrobatic episode, the camera being placed in ways that emphasize the dizzying motions of the acts. But it's not just the flashy bits. There's a lot of stuff here that you'd only notice if you knew what to look for, invisible stuff to the average viewer. For example, this production filmed a lot of coverage. Consider this scene from the episode Stefan's Violin, where Stefan walks into a room where half-finished instruments are hanging from the ceiling, and he retrieves one. It's a simple moment, but count the number of cuts. 6 shots, 5 cuts, meaning the camera was repositioned 6 times in the course of this scene, making sure they had this small moment in as many different angles as possible, then edited them together smoothly, cutting on action to maintain a continuity that your brain reconstructs as a singular moment. He starts to unzip his case, cut. He finishes unzipping his case. He starts to stand up, cut. He finishes standing up. He starts to pull the violin down, cut. He finishes pulling the violin down. The scene didn't need this. You could have communicated this exact same moment with a single shot, but cutting keeps it dynamic and interesting. Which brings us to the show's creator, Paul Saltzman. Saltzman is one of those people you could do an entire 2-hour biographical documentary on, a life that includes being arrested as a civil rights worker in Mississippi in 1965, to studying meditation with the Beatles while in India in 1968, to being the second unit director of the very first IMAX film in 1969. By the time he started the Spread Your Wings project in 1975, he had already had 10 years of filmmaking experience behind him, and had founded Sunrise Films Limited 2 years prior. It was in the middle of shooting another documentary when inspiration struck.
I was in Agra, India, where the Taj Mahal is. I was doing a 1-hour documentary on the Canadian ambassador to India, who was a remarkable human being. And we were standing there at a marble emporium. We had just been to the Taj Mahal, which is an incredible, 7 modern wonders of the world. It's quite stunning. And it's inlaid marble work with semi-precious stones, and it's considered one of the great art creations historically. And we were watching young boys, maybe 8 or 10 years old, and I was filming, doing inlaid marble work, which means carving marble and inlaying semi-precious stones. And I thought, wow, I come from a culture where if you don't have a university degree, you're not considered anything. And here are these kids with no education or little creating something of beauty. And it just opened my own eyes to creativity in the world in a different way. The passing down of creative traditions, like how did these young people learn this? The passing down of creative traditions from one generation to the next in different cultures, and how not only is that essential for people making a living, but not only is it important for that, it's important for creativity and for the sense of self of young people. So that led to doing 2 films that were sort of pilot films in the sense of television pilots, though I didn't know it at the time.
After doing 2 films on spec, filming them without a guarantee of publication, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation came in and began funding Spread Your Wings, producing both English language and French language versions of each film. So with some money in pocket, not a lot, but enough, Saltzman began looking for subjects.
Often it was serendipity. So, for example, I went to Cologne, Germany. I had arranged through phone calls to film a young boy who was a teenager. He was a composer and a concert pianist, and it had passed down from his father or grandfather. And when I got to Cologne with my mini crew, me and my sound person and my second camera person. And when we got to Cologne, he was gone. He had been called to some concert last minute, and there we were. So what do we do now? And I just did a bit of quick research and found that there was a violin making school in southern Germany in Mittenwald in the mountains, and there were 1,000 kids on a waiting list, and they only took in 12 kids a year to learn violin making, cello making, the stringed instruments. And they said, sure, come on. So I drove from Cologne down to southern Germany and made a film about Steve, who was a 16-year-old violinist and learning to make violins. And so sometimes it was just serendipity.
Saltzman wasn't working alone in this. His then wife, Deepa Mehta, credited here as Deepa Saltzman, served as co-executive producer, occasional co-director, and sound person. Born in India, Deepa Mehta would go on to have a very interesting career as a film director herself, her work including her Elemental trilogy, consisting of 1966's Fire, a story about 2 sisters-in-law falling in love, one of India's first LGBT movies, 1998's Earth, about tensions during the 1947 partition, and 2005's Water, about the social restrictions on widows in the country. As for the relationship between this husband and wife team during the production of Spread Your Wings, well...
It was a bad first marriage. You asked me, I'm giving you the truth. It was a lot of conflict, a lot of struggle, because I think neither of us were in the right marriage. And I think probably, well, I don't think, I'm sure Deepa would agree that it wasn't a good pairing.
So, after a few years, 13 of these films had been completed, but the money was getting scarcer and it looked like production would wind down. If Spread Your Wings was to expand, it would need some additional help. Enter Coronet Films. Founded in 1934, Coronet has spent the previous 4 decades producing and distributing documentaries and personal guidance films to schools throughout America. You probably know the image of classrooms in the 1950s sitting down to watch 16mm films like Dating Do's and Don'ts, or Citizenship and You, or Good Table Manners. Coronet was one of the major providers of such films. Pre-1970s Coronet was marked with a large volume of films produced quickly and cheaply. They didn't credit their directors, and they fought against unionization. It was a reputation the company would have to work on going into the 1970s, and one way they did that was less focus on film production and more focus on film acquisition. Sheldon Sachs, appointed the Vice President of Education Films in 1979 and head of the new Perspective Films division, began to attend film festivals and showings in search of high-quality acquisitions for the company, and Spread Your Wings fell into his orbit.
And he brought Coronet to the table, and they put up a distribution guarantee, $400,000, which was a lot of money in that time. We're now talking, 1978 maybe. Meaning if I made the films and delivered them, they would give me $400,000 for the distribution rights to all 26 of them. 13 were already made.
So, on top of being seen on Canadian television, a financially rejuvenated Spread Your Wings, now able to expand to a full 26 films, would be distributed to schools by Coronet, though under a different title. The name Spread Your Wings had poetic resonance that was great for TV, but in a classroom setting, it was decided that a title more explanatory would be appropriate. So the Coronet versions became World Cultures and Youth. World Cultures and Youth was distributed to schools like this, as 16mm film reels, right at the end of the era before VCRs became commonplace. This reel right here is for the film Johannes the Silversmith. You can see from these checkout stickers that this film was being viewed as late as 1999. Inside the case, you can find suggested lesson plans, how to introduce the film, and possible discussions you can have with your students afterwards. VHS elements appear to have been added to the reel after the fact. A Be Kind and Rewind sticker, a classic late 80s FBI warning on the inside of the case. Anyway, there's a very good chance that more American children experience Spread Your Wings in this format, projected in elementary school classrooms, than they did from its brief run on a struggling early cable channel. Nickelodeon only ran through Spread Your Wings once, its place on the channel beginning and ending in 1982. Its function on the channel was basically as a vegetable soup substitute, providing similar educational, multicultural content without vegetable soup's more direct challenges towards racial prejudice and discrimination. Now, I'm not saying that was the motivation, that Cy Schneider didn't want to deal with vegetable soup's politics and replaced it with something more agreeable. There's dozens of possible reasons for the switch, and I definitely don't want to imply that Spread Your Wings wasn't worthy of its airtime. Spread Your Wings is great. How the show connects the lives of young people across the world, showing that they have dreams and they go to school and they work hard and play and have fun just like you. Combining that with the instructional elements of the craft work entwines empathy and education together. And the show had positive influences on its subject matters. All the young people were paid for being in these films, and Saltzman approached the project with the goal of reflecting positivity back towards these children.
But what I discovered was how positive the impact was on the young people themselves. And this is so important in the world of child psychology now that we're much more aware of these types of things, meaning children, child psychology, human beings, how we feel, how we grow, how we are nurtured. So, and part of that is having your beauty reflected to you. It's everything from the infant looking up and seeing a smiling face as opposed to a scowl.
One of the kids featured on the show was 13-year-old Amy Hobby in the United States, who had gotten into hard-edge photography along with her father. Her interactions with Paul Saltzman and his crew got her interested in film production. And she's now a film producer. She produced such works as the Ethan Hawke version of Hamlet, Secretary, and the Academy Award-nominated documentary What Happened, Miss Simone, and recently became the executive director of the Tribeca Film Institute.
And I'm walking towards this 32 or 33-year-old blonde woman who I remember as a 13-year-old, child adult, so to speak. And I put out my hand to shake hands, and she ignores my hand, and she goes right in and gives me a big hug. And I give her a big hug back. And that's kind of a wonderful moment, a wonderful surprise. And we sit down, and after we order, I say, "How did you get into film?" Totally innocent. I say, "How did you get into film?" And she points at me and she says, "You." So there's an example of honoring someone's creativity, and that inspired her to go into filmmaking, and she is an accomplished film producer.
It's one thing to say that a television show was good. It's another to have proof that it did some good in this world. A lot of things were created in Spread Your Wings, from painting to glass blowing, from training horses to developing magic acts, but each of these young people shared the same drive for creation. It doesn't have to be a fancy piece of art, from the garage band trying to find their sound, to the young author developing their first fantasy world, to the kid programming their first video game. We're all tapping into that same creative energy. The same drive that got Stefan to carve his violins and Yoshiko to make her paper art. Hey there, all you creative young adults. You're doing a great job. Keep it up.
Nick, 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 Nickelodeon. Nick, 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 Nickelodeon.
Next time, Nickelodeon tries to tap into the girls love ponies market, but the joke's on them because I also love ponies. A huge thank you to Paul Saltzman. It was a pleasure talking with him and learning more about his work. My complete interview with him will be posted the day after this video goes up. There's a lot I didn't edit into this video. It's totally worth a listen. Today's book recommendations includes Academic Films for the Classroom, A History by Geoff Alexander, which covers the history of educational filmmaking, including looks into the evolution of Coronet. Also have Exploring the Arts, Films and Video Programs for Young Viewers by Paula Rohrlick, a 1982 encyclopedia of educational programming that has the most detailed episode guide for Spread Your Wings you could possibly find. And if you want to experience Spread Your Wings for yourself, well, I have some really good news. With no major home video release outside of the Coronet film reels, this show hasn't been seen for decades, but I have it under good authority that the YouTube channel Encore Plus, under the ownership of the Canada Media Fund, will be putting up Spread Your Wings in its entirety in the near future. I don't have an exact date, but it is coming. While you wait, the channel has a bunch of Canadian television for you, including another Paul Saltzman project, the 80s environmental adventure show, Danger Bay. Thank you all for watching. If you'd like to support Knacks and the Pop Arena in general, I do have a Patreon. Every dollar there is a step towards higher production values and better resources. You can also support the show by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that bell icon for notifications, following the Pop Arena on Twitter, and most importantly, sharing Knacks with your friends. Thank you again, and I hope to see you all soon.